If you want to know how to write a story, start at the very end. And it's kind of the same thing with like projects or models. It goes back to one, know what your deployment or serving strategy is going to be. Like, what is the final output that your model needs to be? Is it a container? Is it a package? And then kind of work back. Like, is it going to be used like, behind an API? Like, understand those like the last details, and then work your way back to like, what do you need to have?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Data Scientist Show. Today we have Mikiko Bazeley, Miki. She's a senior software engineer working on MLOps at Intuit. Previously, she worked as a growth hacker, data analyst in finance, then become a data scientist and transition into machine learning. She has a bachelor's degree in econ, biological anthropology. She did a data science bootcamp at Springboard. She is a tech writer for NVIDIA, and she's working on the course of MLOps. Her goal is to demystify MLOps and show how to develop high-quality ML products from scratch. You can find her content on LinkedIn and YouTube. So basically, she's building cool stuff and showing other people how to build cool stuff with ML. And today we'll talk about useful engineering principles for data scientists, MLOps, and her career journey. And if you have been enjoyed the show, subscribe to the channel and give us a 5-star review. And I'd like to thank our listeners for supporting the show. Now we are the top 100 US tech podcasts in Apple podcast category. And we start look for sponsors. So if you want to sponsor the podcast, send me a message on LinkedIn. Welcome to the show, Miki.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to finally like meet up in person.
Yeah. So how did you get into data science?
Yeah, so when I first graduated college, so initially I went away to college, specifically UC San Diego, and I had initially gone there for biomedical engineering. I had this big dream that, I'm gonna join Doctors Without Borders, I'm gonna go save lives, all that good stuff. And part of it I think was the dream of my family. So my mom is Japanese, and she immigrated here to the U.S. when she was in her early 20s, and she met my dad and they got married. But for the most part, we've always kind of, I would say we're middle class, but that might be stretching it a little bit. I remember growing up, I was born and raised in New York, so growing up and kind of always feeling like I needed to kind of help out my family, become a doctor, a lawyer, engineer, and that pressure is really intense, right?
Yeah.
As an Asian American, it can, or as a second generation or first generation, that pressure to kind of honor the sacrifice, to make money, get a good job, go to right college, and that kind of influenced my decision to try to major in biomedical anthropology biomedical engineering. And so when I got to UC San Diego, I really struggled in most of my classes. It took me about 5 years to graduate from UCSD, and that was in biological anthropology and economics, partially because I was interested in those fields, but also because I just needed to get the credits and the GPA to just get a degree.
Yeah.
I think my final GPA ended up being like 2.4 or 2.6. So I just need to graduate so we could start paying off the college loans, right? The college student loans. So when I graduated, for first couple years, I was really just trying to find any job that would help me pay rent, move out of my parents' apartment. I went back to live with them after college. And the journey to data science was really sort of a bit windy because I started off working at a hair salon, keeping the books, sweeping the hair. Next job was working as a growth hacker at a startup. And that was really like my first startup job. It was just the job that helped pay the rent at $40,000 a year in San Francisco, might I add. And after that, those first two jobs, I got to finally start thinking more about what I wanted to do for a career. Because before that, I didn't really feel like I'd had options. It was a scramble just to kind of, I don't want to say survive, but kind of to survive.
Yeah.
And after my growth hacker job at the recruitment tech startup, which ended up folding 7 months after I joined them, I had to really just kind of like really kind of figure out what is work that I could be doing that's reasonably interesting and that I could continuously grow at.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the first step to data analytics. And after working as a data analyst for a few jobs, eventually I went to Springboard for data science boot camp,
Hmm.
and then that helped me make the full transition over to data scientist job over at Teladoc.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. So, what was it like when you first joined Mailchimp? Later, Mailchimp was acquired by Intuit.
Yeah. And it was a very curious time because I had finally gotten I finally gone like a real data scientist gig at
Hmm.
Teladoc. And that happened about 4 to 5 months before quarantine hit,
Yeah.
So at that point in time, I don't know if everyone remembers this, like the first like 3 or 4 months, companies were laying people off left and right.
Mm.
Almost kind of like it is a little bit now in the last
Yeah.
2 months, but all the major tech companies, Uber, uh, definitely, I think Google and Apple might have laid people off. Definitely Twitter. I remember that. Like many of the major companies were laying people off.
Hmm.
So when Teladoc, or so originally I was working at a company called Livongo. They were bought out by Teladoc, and when they were bought out, we were given like a year's guarantee that no one's going to be laid off.
Okay.
And my family was like, "Oh, this is really great. This is exciting." And I was like, I want to switch to MLOps,
Mm.
actually. I knew I wanted to, because I think I ran into the story that a lot of MLOps engineers run into, where you try to put a model in production and then stuff just breaks.
Yeah.
Or like you have your model in a Jupyter notebook and then you show it to your business partners and key stakeholders and they're like, "Okay, great. Now how can you like automate this for us?" And it's like,
Mm.
"Oh, wow, I didn't even like really think about that. I thought I would just train a model and I would do the analysis and I will kind of give it to you."
Yeah.
Now they're asking for a retraining schedule. They're asking
Mm.
like, "Oh, if we refresh the data, can you run it manually?" So, when that happened, I was like, I think I want to move towards the problem of how to make data science and ML work in production.
Mm.
And so I took a personal 6 month, what I call a sabbatical, where I quit my job. Um, decided I would come up with my own study plan, my own
Yeah.
curriculum for how to transition to an MLOps engineer. And then when I joined Mailchimp, at that point I'd had 3 full offers on the table for
Okay.
MLOps roles. I had another 1 or 2 kind of I was like waiting to hear back on in terms
Mm-hmm.
of whether they were going to go to offer, but like very strongly believed they would have. And a few other interviews like in the pipeline. So, when I joined Mailchimp, it was still remote. It was like my first real MLOps role. And it was also after, during those 6 months, I was also working on like a real estate tech startup.
Mm-hmm.
So it was refreshing and really nice to join Mailchimp at that time because my team was so cool. And also too, like a lot of them were career changers, which
Mm-hmm.
is very like different, I think, in tech. A lot of times you don't run into a team where at least 50% or a significant number of people on that
Mm-hmm.
team, especially in like platform engineering, are self-taught or they're like kind of late stage engineers,
Yeah. Yeah. Do you remember the first project you worked on after you joined?
Okay, so data science models in production. Like how does the data science model get there?
Mm-hmm.
And the early part is like everyone I think understands the feature engineering and then you train the model and then you pickle it off or maybe you package it in a container or all that jazz. But how do you ensure that you're minimizing the amount of like human errors that occur in the development and the deployment of it?
Mm-hmm.
And also how do you make sure you're not like rebuilding the house from scratch like all the
Yeah.
time? So one of the first tools or projects I worked on was the way we templated data science projects was through a cool tool called Cookiecutter.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people are probably familiar with various cookie cutters out there, and essentially a cookie cutter it's a project that can be modified. Uh, I think most people are probably familiar with the data science cookie cutter project from Driven Data, and so we had our own internal version of it
Okay.
where
So for
yeah.
people who are not familiar with, can you explain a little bit what is it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Cookiecutter project, it is a way to scaffold or template projects in any sort of language.
Mm.
It's a command line application that you can modify with the tools or packages and libraries or the structure that you want it to. And literally, the entire purpose of Cookiecutter is you provide some like arguments in like a command line prompt. So it'll ask you these questions, you provide these like arguments or values, and then it will customize the resulting like project structure
Mm.
according to those inputs.
Got it. Is it like declarative programming?
It's very similar. It's meant to facilitate that kind of ease. But even though this was like the first project that I worked on, we eventually kind of realized that the approach that we were doing with it, and to
Mhm.
be honest, a lot of people do this approach when they're trying to templatize data science projects, was actually pretty clunky.
Yeah.
Because what ended up was we took this like scaffolding tool, we just loaded it up with all these different kind of like these sort of decision like points where it's like, okay, do you need Kubernetes? Yes or no? Do you need Airflow? Yes or no?
Mm.
And we were asking like the data scientists to kind of make a lot of tooling and architecture decisions that maybe they really didn't need to.
Yeah.
And more importantly, it was a lot of maintenance, like maintenance and overhead on
Mm.
us as like a team to maintain it. So that was the first project I worked on. But more recently, we've been actually trying to move away from local data science project development to like pure cloud native remote development. We think
Mhm.
that's like a lot better, honestly.
Yeah. So, what was your frustration when you worked on those projects?
I mean, there was two or three categories of frustration I had. One was the tooling itself. It felt like we were trying to adjust for all the possible use cases of the tool, and
Mhm.
as a result, that made it more complicated for like our main key stakeholders to use, which is the data scientists.
Yeah.
Right? They are 100% like our main customers, and so we were trying to give them all these options, and that just like made it really like confusing for them,
Mm.
so not only was the internals of like cookie cutter becoming very complex, it was developing into this like case of tribal knowledge. Like you kind of had to know why people made certain decisions in developing it or adding the libraries that they did. And the second part was like the user experience. Like it wasn't great for the data scientists, it wasn't great for us to use.
Yeah.
But the third like category of frustration that it kind of exposed was how little empathy and conversation is happening between the two groups,
Yeah.
right? Because on the one hand, if you want to put them all in production, like there are certain, it does have to have certain quality like indicators, right?
Yeah.
Like it does have to pass certain quality checks. I think everyone understands that. No one wants something to break,
Mhm.
you know? On the other hand, we also need to be flexible that like some types of like data science models or features, they do require different architectures. So it is a little bit of a balance in like trying to give enough freedom to be creative and to like innovate, but at the same time making sure that we're still delivering like a very solid like engineering product. Because like for example, if you're a user, I'll just use a, like Netflix, for example, right? And let's say you're looking for like an episode or a show that when you search for it on Google search, it showed up as being on Netflix, but then you
Mhm.
search the Netflix search like engine, and then Netflix doesn't bring it up. Like
Yeah.
that's a totally like frustrating user experience.
Mhm.
So we don't want to have that kind of thing, for example, in any products, in any recommendation products we use,
Got it.
right? So it's a hard balance for sure.
Mhm. Yeah. So previously you mentioned the frustration that sometimes your stakeholder, which are data scientists, are not happy with the tools. I can totally resonate with that. So I
Yeah.
used to collaborate with the engineering team when I was at Amazon, and when I want to develop either a data pipeline or a model, and then they're like, okay, wait, I create a wrapper or something for you. So basically some type
Yeah.
of DevOps tools, right? At that time, I think they just call it everything is like a wrapper. And they're so excited to share that with me. And then they're like, okay, you can just read this wiki and do this command line thing. They think it's so cool, but I don't know how to do those command line thing. I don't know how to do like Java. And they're like, yeah, it's very easy. It's just like one line of code. But
Oh, that's so
how do I
frustrating.
run this? How do I debug this? Maybe it's something very foundational for an engineer, but for data scientists, we don't have that
Yeah.
language. And at that time, I was a junior data scientist.
Yeah.
I didn't know, is this normal or am I not meeting the bar? Do I lack those skill sets? So it also made me feel I don't know whether I'm asking the right questions.
Yeah.
So it was also hard for me to give them direct feedback, just to tell them, hey, I don't know how to use this.
I mean, did they even ask you for feedback when they were designing it? Like, how did they identify that, like, what pain point were they identifying with the tools that they were giving the data scientists? Did they ever, like, ask you also?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think to clarify, the type of tools they build is not something like a big DevOps tools. It's more like a small script.
And even those small things,
yeah,
like,
it's the
sometimes
small
hurt you
things.
so
Exactly.
badly.
Yeah. So it's usually just happening in casual conversations.
Yeah.
Back in the days when we go to the office, I would just ask, hey, how do we put this in the production? They're like, oh yeah, I will build something for you. So that's like the conversation. There's no on the drawing on the board to talk about what do I want, what's the output, how I'm going to use it. So usually they're pretty excited. They're very excited to help data scientists, but
they do have their own vision, right?
Yeah,
it's almost like
they
they're not
don't
even looking
yeah,
at
they didn't ask me what language are you familiar with, and I didn't ask them how are they gonna develop that. We just have a lot of assumptions in our head. Just expect this thing will go smoothly. You probably have similar experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's interesting because I know there are a lot of influencer thought leadership people out there who are like, well, one of the problems is data scientists don't know how to code. And I'm like, that is the most laziest take you could possibly have. Unfortunately, it's like, it's not even a hot take anymore because I think if you talk to any like data scientists, like, and you ask them like, what's the stereotype about you, as a data scientist, they'd be like, oh, that we don't know how to code. Right. And I don't think that's quite true. Like I do know a lot of data scientists who actually they spent some years as software engineers.
Yeah.
And their kind of more thinking was like, okay, I'm going to take the software engineering programming skills I developed, I'm going to apply it, and I'm going to go, apply it in data science. I'm going to create cool products, but so I think the stereotype is like not 100% true. And more importantly, I also think that it's like such a lazy take. It's like, oh, well, all the challenges are because like data scientists know how to code. Like I've made jokes like that too, but at the same time, like I think it's lazy because at the end of the day, and we had this kind of experience too, with like at various companies I've been at where like certain stages of the model development, like it's like training and development, deployment, serving are like all three different teams.
Yeah.
And maybe the only team that would have had any sort of like experience or empathy with like data scientists or the data science process is like the training development team.
Yeah.
And deployment serving is all like hardcore DevOps folks, and they just have no idea. Like they're like, why can't data scientists get with the system? And you see this all the time, right? Like, so as a data scientist, have you ever had to go through like an agile process?
Yeah.
What was that like?
I think we usually don't do stand-ups because a lot of our projects are research focused. So we do something like a Kanban board, but maybe if we're collaborating with the engineers, we do the Azure process.
Yeah. And it can be kind of stressful, right?
Yeah. Because, sometimes they ask me how long do I estimate I'll deliver something like
points?
A model. How many points exactly? I'm like, oh, I don't know.
It's almost like better to be like, is this something I can do in a day, a week, or a month?
Yeah.
It's almost like you don't even want to go to points at that point. You're just like,
exactly. I can let you know after I start working on it a little bit, but that's not how the planning works.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because like I've been on both sides of the fence, right? I've worked as a data analyst, I've worked as a data scientist, now working as an MLOps engineer, and it's interesting because I think like what ends up happening is that everyone is so challenged in their individual area that sometimes they don't like look up like across the across the ocean and go like, oh, like what are the challenges that like those folks are
Yeah.
experiencing?
Hmm.
So it's like for a lot of engineers or like, platform or MLOps or whatnot, I think they look at data science and go like, well, what are you guys complaining about? This is just a command line tool. Like,
Yeah.
why can't you like get with the program? And then it's like on like from the data science perspective, there's this like fragmentation of tool and process. And I just I can't I feel for them a lot because
Mm.
they have to deal with product, they have to deal with like the platform like tooling folks, and they have to
Yeah.
also like still drive their own projects.
Hmm.
And I don't know, I feel like as MLOps folks we can kind of have a little bit more empathy for like our data scientists who are our main like customers who are driving value with our tools,
Hmm.
and just try to like get to like a much better, smoother user experience.
Yeah. So now you're becoming the MLOps engineer you wish you had when you were a data scientist.
Yeah. Well, yeah, hopefully. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it helps, right?
Hmm.
Having that kind of empathy and like active listening.
Yeah. So maybe for the listeners to better understanding your workflow, can you share basically now understanding data scientist pain point? What's your day to day like in different stages of your project? So, for example, in the beginning, how did you communicate with them? How do you develop the solution? And how do you put it in production?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's worth talking about kind of the different personas that you see out there because, and I had this convo with like a few folks where they kept saying ML engineer and I'm like ML ops engineer. They're like ML engineer. I'm like ML ops engineer. And I like, so ignoring the
Sometimes I
title.
mix those two.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
it's like ignoring like let's ignore the title. I feel
Hmm.
like it comes down to people who are developing like the pipelines and projects, people who are developing the infrastructure and tooling
Yeah.
that allow those like models and projects to like
Hmm.
get through, right? So like I'm more on the tooling platform side persona right now. We're thinking of kind of ways to facilitate like better communication
Hmm.
with and engagement with the data scientists. So we're kind of thinking about like potentially creating other personas that are closer to like the like ML pipeline, like develop it persona.
Yeah.
But for me, as like on the infrastructure and tooling persona part, the basically kind of since we're close, we're more of like an engineering team in that
Hmm.
regard. So we can kind of do like a light agile process where we have like a significant list of like pain points and wish list items and features and all that the data science have requested. We try to kind of figure out sort of what are kind of the biggest like pain points that we should be tackling and how can we kind of incorporate those into our existing like platform. And sometimes it also does require looking at other tools other than what
Mm.
we offer. Once we've kind of figured out sort of like the rough user stories or like what are the big kind of chunks of work we think we need to tackle. Like for example, right now like we have like a couple main patterns that we support. So for example, we do a lot of like the batch pre-computed.
Hmm.
For example, that's one pattern we
So
support.
what is a batch pre-computed?
So batch pre-computed. Okay, so online inference. So let's build out kind of like a use case. Let's say, for example, someone wants to understand what's their forecasted net worth, actually, like 10 years down the line, right? So there's like two or three ways that we could kind of offer that. One is, let's say, for example, we have millions of users like on the app and they all want a projection of their net worth or like a forecast of their net worth like 10 years from now, right?
Yeah.
So we could do a couple things. We could like calculate all the values. We'll train a model, use that to then calculate all the values for all the 1 million users, like let's say, for example, on a weekly or bi-weekly process. And maybe we do like segments of those like 1 million users. And we pre-compute it, we stash it in a table, and then when they go in to log into their account, basically like there's two ways to do it. We can either have that like value already pre-computed, like already predicted, and it will just serve it up like in the site. We could also do the prediction like on the fly, like at that
Mm.
moment. So maybe like we just have the model and it's shipped as like a container or like a Python package or something like that or a library. And then when they do like, okay, like show me my net worth, it'll send that API call right to the live service. So those are the two main patterns we support. I think that's like
Okay.
probably 80% of what you see in industry, maybe
Yeah.
90. Yeah, we have some kind of hybrid ones where like for a time we were trying to look at tools like Dataflow because they kind of said like, hey, we will sort of unite like batch and streaming. But like we're sort of only starting to experiment with like streaming, frankly. Yeah. So I mean, like, but let's say for example, the problem there is like the data scientists have said, hey, right now it takes forever to train the model
Yeah.
or also to like the latency is like not great or whatever. And let's say for example, instead of like taking 20 hours to train the model, right? They want to do it in like 2 hours. Or let's say there's some business need that we need to get the training down. So maybe like the big kind of story there is let's look at options for distributed computing, like Spark or what have you. So once we've kind of figured out what that big story is, then we start breaking it down into, or let's say for example, we need like a model warehouse or what have you. Then we'll start breaking down into like kind of actual like tasks that need to be accomplished. And then we'll like kind of dole that out to people based off of like availability and stuff like that.
Got it. And what is the most challenging part of your work?
I think the most challenging part is balancing like three core components. One is building the tools because like you do need like everyone needs heads down time to like kind of actually create something new. I'd say the second part is also unblocking the data scientists when they like do run into issues. Like we really sort of like, I don't know if we've quite frankly found that balance. And a lot of times we've had to say like, we're not going to do both. Like maybe for a few quarters, the data scientists are honestly on their own. And then we just like focus on building the platform or we swing to the other way. So we're still trying to find like what that right balance is. I'd say the third component that's like really hard to balance is like maintenance and like maintenance and bugs. That's like the really challenging part to me because I think everyone gets really excited about building stuff, but the hard part of like chasing down the bugs and also making sure that the experience is like smooth and it's improving, right? The smoothness is improving over time. I think that's like the really like balancing those three elements, I think is probably the most challenging part, honestly, of like being an MLOps engineer right now.
Yeah. So for folks to understanding like kind of the differences between data scientist, ML engineer, and ML ops, basically you don't train any ML models.
We do not.
Yeah. So they train a model and then deliver that model for you. So data scientists train a model. I think in some companies, ML engineer train a model, or some companies like Amazon, we're called applied scientists. They will train a model, and sometimes they will also put a model in production for ML engineers or applied scientists. But I don't know how much of the serving, the type of work, the pipeline work they do. I think some ML engineer does do some ML ops engineering type of work. They're building pipelines, don't do too much on the model development side. So I think there is a slight overlap. Depends on what organization.
Yeah, it really depends on like the
Yeah.
organization size and maturity, right? And I think there's been some really great talks and blog posts out there that kind of dig into a little bit more. For example, if we take a startup that's like very small, but everyone there is like very data savvy and very like nimble,
Yeah.
but startups don't have a lot of resources. I think that like their role structure and stack is going to look very, very different from like an enterprise like a Fortune 500 company where maybe their main core business is not in tech and really hasn't been involved in anything data sciencey. So I'm trying to think of like ones out there, like any of the CPG brands, for example, real estate too. Like if we ignore like Zillow and Redfin, if we look at like traditional like residential real estate or what have you, that's like an industry that's maybe not super tech savvy, although they're not like big companies. Those tend to be more sort of free agents. Maybe airlines, cruise liners. For a lot of them, like their main bread and butter has not necessarily been like data and data science, machine learning.
Yeah.
But they have a ton of resources usually at their disposal, right? They can afford the big cloud vendors, but startups maybe cannot. And so I think that's like something that like we need to definitely consider when we talk about roles is like what is like the maturity and like the main business or the main book of business for like that organization for sure.
Yeah. And so it would be great for a data scientist or machine learning engineer to have a MLOps engineer to support their work. But some organizations, there's just one data scientist
Yeah.
doing all the work from data engineering to the DevOps.
Yeah.
So it's definitely useful for data scientists to adopt engineering best practices, and even if you're collaborating with someone like you.
Yeah.
So what is something you think is most important for data scientists to learn?
Yeah, I mean, I think like skills come in like levels, right? So there's like certain skills that are just like table stakes. They're level 1, right? Like anyone who touches code should have these skills. And I think the main like 3 are like really understanding and working with version control for your code. The second one is understanding like containerization and packaging strategies is a huge one because like your code or your model, it needs to get out there somehow. I'd say a third is understanding like basic web technology, understanding like deployment patterns. I think that that's huge.
Yeah.
Regardless of kind of, once again, like you have to get your model out there somewhere or somehow. So you should kind of like have a plan for that. I'd say like the fourth one is so version control, testing, logging. Those are also like table stakes. It doesn't matter if you're a data scientist, a data engineer, or an MLOps engineer, an ML engineer. You should kind of know, like, you should make sure that your code is working,
Yeah.
right? And it should be working under both like best case scenario, but also as much as possible, you should be able to simulate like worst case scenario too. I think those are like table stakes. Like if you're a data scientist, MLOps engineer, you should have those skills, period.
Yeah. What are something specific about web development?
Yeah, absolutely. It might be better to say one should have an awareness cloud technology and also designing like distributed systems or distributed applications. Yeah, I think it's better to say distributed applications as opposed to systems.
Okay.
Right? Like I think you as a data scientist, like this goes back to the whole you should know how your code or your model is getting out there in the world. Not just as like a package or container that you like upload to PyPI or GitHub or whatnot, but if you yourself want to use that model, um, or let's say for example you build like a very heavy model, you'd want to actually be able to test it to see if people could even use it like as an API. I think would be super important because if people can't, then you're kind of not making your value and your hard work accessible.
Yeah.
You know?
But how do you test those? Do you think data scientists should write unit tests, or how can they test their
Yeah, I think they should write all the tests. Well, so testing code is what I would consider a level 1 skill. Testing models and data, I would consider then the next level of skills where it's like this is the thing you should know how to do like as like a someone specializing in data science, right? As like a domain expert there. So with models, right? The big thing you want to check is whether or not like the predictions they're spitting out are not only like accurate and what you would expect, but in some cases you want to make sure that they're fair and unbiased. Is a huge one. The easiest way would be to not use like personally identifiable information like PII. That would be the easiest way. But sometimes it's not good enough because like for example like real estate data, because of like in the US, because we had a history of redlining, which for most people who don't know, like redlining was a series of, it wasn't strict policies, but it was a practice of when people were giving loans with favorable interest rates through, I think the predecessors to Fannie Mae and Fannie Mac, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I think the predecessors to that, to those organizations, they would give these loans with favorable interest rates, but depending on the color of the recipient, for example, if you were like a person of color, you got a much worse interest rate than someone who was Caucasian.
Yeah.
Right. And this also depended on the neighborhood too. So, for example, if you were a person of color, There there were only certain neighborhoods where they're saying like we'll even like loan you, we'll even give you a mortgage. And the redlining comes from the fact that on these maps they would literally line that neighborhood in red,
Yeah.
and in different colors too for different groups of people, right? But for if you're doing any kind of data science or machine learning right now on like residential real estate, or sorry, just real estate in general, there's a really good chance that if you're using that data for some kind of, let's say, for example, prediction of a person's net worth, or like whether or not you should lend them like future loans, you could be perpetuating bias, right? And so these are things that I think people need to think about, like with their models.
Yeah.
Is like what it's not just like does the model give the expected result, but also if you were to dig in deeper with those models, can you ensure that they're also not harming like the users, right? And then for testing data, I think that's more of a like it helps with first off making sure that junk isn't getting into your model in the first place, but also to understand like the statistical distributions of certain features, and to like be able to identify ahead of time whether you're going to have a data drift issue for your model.
Yeah. So do you design some tests to detect those issues, or you rely data scientists to do that part of the job?
We kind of we'll partner with them. So essentially like for anything involving the model or sort of domain knowledge about the problem they're trying to solve, there's an expectation that they will at least like contribute heavily to writing the test for that.
Yeah.
But when it comes to, for example, it's not reasonable for us to expect data scientists to set up their own like monitoring on their
Yeah.
data science models, right? We would want that to be templatized as much as possible.
Yeah.
Other things, for example, like for data drift, right? So if they use, I think Great Expectations has recently started making a big push to like doing statistical like measures. But let's say, for example, the data scientist is working on their model, and like they've done the analysis on the different features. And let's say, for example, they know that this one feature is like I don't know, a normal distribution, but in production it ends up being like bimodal or something like that. Like the MLOps engineer is not really going to necessarily know if that happens, or also if it's like a bad thing.
Yeah.
Whereas the data scientists are interfacing very closely with the business partners. And so that's something that like we can help with the tooling. We can help out with some of the more custom like and gnarly engineering bits.
Yeah.
But in terms of figuring out like what is like a good versus a bad range, what does like success look like to the business, we kind of have to lean on the data scientists for that. Like they're as much our partners as we are theirs.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah. So say if a data scientist has a really good engineering skills and want to deploy their own model and maybe also try to scale the solution, do you collaborate with data scientists, or is there like a line, hey, that's not your job, we do this for you?
Yeah, I mean, so first off, if a data scientist is like kind of expressing a desire to do more engineering work, ideally we'd like to like recruit them to our team. Want to go steal them?
Yeah.
We so it's tricky, right? Because to a certain extent, for us to maintain quality and to ensure like there are like happy paths, that kind of means like we need to sort of like agree on like what a happy path looks like.
Yeah.
And so we do have some data scientists who like, so there's nothing from our part where we say you can't go learn and continue to grow as a data scientist. But it's also one of these things where it's like, as a MLOps team, like not only do we work with data scientists, but we also work with our data engineering teams.
Yeah.
We also work with security. We also work with our like DevOps teams, because we have DevOps teams that are purely focused on like non-data science machine learning projects or products. Because like, for example, Mailchimp has like an email marketing product that has been around much longer than data science and machine learning at Mailchimp, right? So we do have a DevOps team that is purely focused on that too, right? So as like the MLOps team, we interface and represent in some ways all these teams to our data science partners. And so for us, it's like we want to we don't want to curb innovation, but at the same time, like we also pay the penalty if, like, for example, a data science model like gets out into the world and is not properly like secured. It doesn't have like the right tests. It gets pushed to
Mm-hmm.
production. Like product does a big push to get users to use it. It starts breaking and we have no idea why. So it's one of these things where it's like, on the one hand, you as a data scientist, you're kind of giving, you're putting your trust in us that we will develop like the right infrastructure and tooling that you need. And that also means that we take on the burden and the joys and the burden of also making sure that like the models and like the projects and the pipelines like align with what the company says is like, okay, this is like secure software, this is software that works, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's a balance, right?
Yeah, yeah. So now, say if a data scientist come to you, say, "Hey, can you help us decrease the latency?" So for those type of problem, usually where do you look at in a model? Where do you start?
Yeah, at least like at Mailchimp and also at other places.
Mm-hmm.
um we do have like different teams that correspond to different parts of the life cycle. So, for example, like my team, we work a lot on the training and development environment,
Yeah.
right? Like we're on that front. We have a team that works on more of like the serving layer, and we also have a team that is like focused on observability, right? And other kinds of projects. So, like if we know that, for example, a model is like running really slow, like the first people we'll talk to is like the serving team.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times like we can kind of do like if for example the model or service that is slow corresponds to like the live service or like the API based like model, usually like if the latency is really kind of slow, we'll first have to look at um is it still like working as like expected, right? Like has anything changed about the code? Were there any like
Mm.
releases that happened? We get like a significant amount of like logging information between all the different tools we use, and it's like Airflow, Kubernetes, Stackdriver, because we're a GCP house. Like we can get some information on like what's going on. Another place we'll look at is also the size of the model. We'll also look at too like the feature and like the feature engineering code, right?
Feature engineering code.
Yeah, because like sometimes like for example, and that's the trade-off between like if you have a batch pre-computed
Mm-hmm.
um like a table of values that's already there. So if we have that, for example, and like let's say that's going slow, that gives us a lot more options to look at, because that should be like a basic lookup from a table,
Mm-hmm.
right? That should not be going like super slow. The prediction's not going to be super fresh, and it might not be individualized to that like user session, but it should be pretty fast. For a live service, that's going to be a lot more complicated. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, for example, like if let's go back to that like forecasting net worth
Yeah.
example, right? Let's say, for example, that now they don't just want like a forecast of their net worth, but let's say they want the next step of like we have all their information in terms of like all the different assets someone has, and this is not actually like a real product. This is like an example one.
Yeah.
So just in case anyone's wondering, we don't actually have this, like, as far as I know. But hypothetical product, someone wants they then want to know, like, okay, you've given me my net worth. I know what I want target net worth, right? So it's like you've told me in 10 years my net worth is going to be 1 million, but you know what? I want 10 million. So let's say then we have like a request to add a feature where we then give that person like targeted suggestions, right? And let's say part of that feature is like a little text box where the person types in like all their projects and all their side hustles they got going on. So now we have like an NLP use case where we need to then like parse it and then like try to predict. Um, so one of the challenges that could be happening is like in order, like first off, there needs to be like not just feature engineering code, but there needs to be like processing on that text, like that text information.
Mm.
There also needs to be processing on all like the quantitative data about their net worth. Like let's say we know their stocks and also their stuff, right? And so that processing, like to then send it as an API call to get a prediction on it, that could actually be like, what's taking so long?
Yeah.
It might not be like, it might be like once like the API call has gone through, the prediction is like pretty fast,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe like that data processing pipeline is like the real issue, right? So we do kind of have to sort of like be detectives and kind of work back from like, if we know this project was working before,
Mm-hmm.
can we start tracing it back to the day and time that it
Yeah.
started to slow down? And then from there, it's like, then you have to kind of work from the end to the beginning and just kind of troubleshoot, test, deploy. I think that's like, that emphasizes honestly the importance of like having like a really good development, deployment, and like release process on the code, you know?
Yeah. And do you think for folks who are interested in being a MLOps, that what
MLOps engineer.
ML? Yeah, we're talking about so many roles. MLOps engineer, do they have to know machine learning? Can they just be really good at scaling solutions and doing some serving those type of work?
Yeah, I mean, like, so in terms of going into like MLOps, right? I think the biggest challenge is just making sure that you actually have like the software engineering skills
Yeah.
and having the knowledge of like how to develop like solutions with like cloud offerings and also like open source like tools and packages too. I think that's going to be the greater bottleneck, but I don't think you have to be like a data science machine learning expert to be a
Yeah.
good MLOps engineer. I think like empathy and like active listening and like being unafraid to have like the hard conversations, I think that goes like a long way, because I've seen a lot of DevOps engineers kind of like make the transition of like building MLOps tooling and libraries, and then they're kind of like, why aren't the data scientists using it? And it's like, well, it seems like they don't have like a core understanding of like their
Yeah.
main user base.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, my advice to them always is like, look, just like, it's like, go take a machine learning class, go try to build a pipeline yourself,
Yeah.
you know, like end to end. It doesn't have to be like a million projects. Just go build one end to end,
Mm-hmm.
and then feel the suffering and pain, and then that will lead you to build like a better like product, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I definitely do see some like engineers where I think they have that attitude of like everything is code. And it's like, yeah, but people in process too.
Yeah.
I mean, there's reasons why I feel like I've heard so many data scientists like tell me horror stories of trying to do an agile process. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, like there's a reason why it's painful, right?
Yeah. And so, what are some tools you use? And also, you mentioned some open source tools. What's your tech stack?
Yeah. So, it's funny because like MLOps, like I don't think there's an MLOps like there's not an MLOps stack, is there, out there? Like not really. Not like the way people pioneered the modern data stack.
Yeah.
So in some ways our tooling is very plain. We are a GCP house. So a lot of BigQuery, a lot of like GCS, Google Cloud Storage. We I'm trying to remember if we actually use like PubSub. We might. I don't remember if we actually use Kafka or like PubSub. Yeah, we use Dataflow. We also use Terraform, Airflow, Kubernetes, Docker. In terms of libraries and packages, I mentioned Great Expectations.
Yeah.
We try to support honestly like anything the data scientists really use for models. So like scikit-learn, TensorFlow, PyTorch, Hugging Face, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
We don't actively use those ourselves, but we like try to support it. GitHub, Jenkins. Our like serving solution is like home built in house.
Okay.
Spanner, and that's it for now. There's like other tools we're looking at though, for sure.
Yeah. So throughout the past few years, what are some emerging tools that you think going to be more and more important? Or what are some tools you think might be deprecated in a few years?
I don't know if we'll ever see a solution that truly like unites streaming and batch that is also accessible to data scientists. Because like certain products like Dataflow, they actually work pretty decently. Like once you kind of get them working, like in production, like they're great, they're solid. But I don't know. I think it kind of depends on like how much we want the tooling to be accessible to data scientists, right? Like
Yeah.
if we're okay with this idea that MLOps tooling is maintained and built like by engineers, then I think maybe we'll see a solution that like actually like facilitates both stream and batch. It would be kind of curious. I think the other two or three sort of like big questions in MLOps tooling right now are one is like model pipeline orchestration. Like I feel like in some of the Slack channels, I constantly see a fight between like Kubeflow and like other type of like orchestrators. So I'm kind of curious to see like what happens there because I feel like that's like some of the biggest challenges is like right now most people's home built solutions is like a wrapper around Airflow,
Yeah.
which like a wrapper around Airflow plus Kubernetes. And I don't know if that I don't think people love that solution. So I think that's like one big area where I'd be curious to see like where the tooling happens. The third area I was always kind of curious about was like notebooks as like being the center of like an end-to-end MLOps pipeline.
Mm.
I don't know how I really kind of feel about that. Like I know Amazon and Google are like kind of trying to fight with each other with like Amazon with SageMaker and like Google has like Vertex AI. So I'd be kind of curious to see like how that ends up playing out in terms of like do they really come up with like an end-to-end like MLOps like platform or solution. Another area that I think could be kind of curious, well, so all the large language like all the open source like large language models that are popping up, that's kind of like really interesting because like OpenAI, like they released a bunch of stuff over the last couple years, but people were like, we don't want to pay OpenAI prices.
Yeah.
So seeing also trends in like how open source like connects with MLOps or even like deep learning to me is really fascinating to see like how those communities like continue to develop. I think also too like so MLOps versus like data engineering. Like as MLOps engineer, I collaborate pretty closely with our data engineering teams.
Yeah.
But there is like some overlap, right, in terms of tooling and skills. So, and a lot of the tools that we're using like right now in MLOps are DevOps or data engineering tools, right? Like at least at least like for big companies, I feel like a lot of those tools end up being the same. The curious part will actually be to see how startups and mid-sized companies implement MLOps, because I think that's where we might maybe we'll see an MLOps stack there. I kind of thought the modern data stack was a little bit stupid, to be honest. Like
Yeah.
not like the actual stack itself. Like I think DBT and Snowflake and all those other tools are great, but the concept that there was this like one data stack to me was a little bit weird. So I would be kind of curious to see like if people like how startups and like smaller mid-sized companies come up with like MLOps stacks or if they do that.
Yeah.
I think that'll be kind of interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's a one size fit all.
Yeah.
For different company, like you mentioned, different industry, different stages of the company, they might adopt different type of tools. And even within the same company, like in Amazon, they're so big. There are some teams develop their own tools. They're using other tools, but well, in Amazon, you use Amazon Web Services. I actually never used the GCP, so I'm kind of curious. What was the choice? What is the comparison between AWS and GCP?
Yeah, I mean, so the choice for GCP was definitely made by many engineers before me. For Mailchimp, yeah, like maybe like 5-10 years ago. I'm not 100% sure like when we first like got our foot in the door on GCP. I know like for us they've been like a huge partner in terms of like helping us like implement and deploy stuff. And part of it too is like I think Mailchimp, so they are a 20-year-old company.
Yeah.
We still have data centers that we like we have, right? So one of the benefits of like being a private company is that you don't always have to you can make longer term like engineering decisions. Sometimes what that also means is that companies don't always get into like they don't always innovate maybe like at the same pace or timeline as like other companies.
Yeah.
So the thing that I think was really smart was like basically like my predecessors and people who are many pay grades above me at some point said like, hey, you know, we need to move fast on the data science machine learning stuff. We need to be a bit more flexible. So why don't we like make sure that all the data science, data engineering, machine learning folks are on GCP while the rest of the company can still be like on-prem. And I think that was like a very smart decision. In terms of like as a user developer on AWS versus GCP, I feel like GCP is just a lot simpler, frankly, than AWS. For
Hmm.
one thing, like they have a lot less products
Yeah.
than AWS has. But I think like because I've seen people basically like they've asked me the question of like, oh, which cloud vendor should I learn?
Yeah.
And on the one hand, I'm like, well, you should use whatever cloud vendor your company uses, even if that is like Azure, for example.
Hmm.
Um, at the same time, like I think some of the most impactful, useful projects, like for machine learning and data science, they are open source.
Mm.
So what GCP, AWS, and Azure do is like a lot of these open source, like popular, very valuable projects, they end up hosting and managing a version like of that project anyway.
Yeah.
So I kind of feel like if you learn like if you have a good understanding of like databases and data warehouses in like AWS, like translating that knowledge and generalizing it to GCP is probably not as difficult. Like probably the thing that's a little bit tricky is like security and permissions.
You have to relearn all
Yeah.
the lingos again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But I don't think like as long as you understand like the fundamentals,
Hmm.
I think that will go a lot farther than like having to learn cloud. But I was really shocked to find out that like Azure, while it doesn't have AWS's cloud share, it is like it has 2 or 3 times the
Hmm.
global share than GCP does.
Yeah.
Like I was really surprised to find that out. And
Hmm.
apparently Azure is like really popular in Europe. Is what someone
Oh,
told me.
okay. Interesting.
So, I mean, maybe that might influence people's decisions to
Hmm.
learn like a specific cloud vendor, but
Yeah. Cool. And these days, I also read a lot of MLOps, ML engineering people talk about streaming. Have you have any experience to work on streaming platforms?
I have not. I think Dataflow was honestly like the closest I
Hmm.
got to that. I do think that my understanding is that there are some startups like in the space now that are like focused on streaming for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
I think part of it too is like I just don't see. I feel like the streaming is almost like a thing that you only see in like the most cutting edge companies.
Hmm.
I feel like a majority of like companies, especially in like the SMB startup kind of size and maturity, it might be like a very sophisticated use case that they don't maybe need to consider yet.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense because it's a new thing, and then everything related to like speed. I think people are so interested about. But I also talked to some other ML engineers. That you don't always have to have those like online models serving like
Yeah.
live results, and you can sometimes do a batch. It really depends on your use case because
Yeah.
streaming is expensive. When you think about your model performance and how it's used, I think cost is also a big part. Do you really need it to be delivered that fast?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like what it comes down to is like strategy, right? For some
Mm,
companies, like streaming is core to their strategy,
yeah.
and for most, it really isn't. And it's one of these things where it's like, so if a company had to like figure out whether or not they were supporting like streaming machine learning
Hmm.
versus like good like code practices, for example,
Yeah.
or like having like more like a more painless experience.
Hmm.
I think most people would say like, well, if you have like a less painful experience, if you have less friction in like deploying your in like data scientists being able to deploy models or develop them like in
Yeah.
your company,
Hmm.
that probably will get you more money. And especially if they're writing like more efficient code and also there's that probably will like get you back more money than like investing in like a new technology like
Yeah.
immediately.
Hmm.
I like there are like stages of maturity I think companies probably should consider, especially like making things like less worse for people.
Yeah.
I'm always a fan of making things like less painful.
Yeah. And so when data scientists creating a machine learning model and train on the current data set, a historical data set, it's hard for data scientists to know how will this model scale. So basically, can they do something to make your job easier?
Yeah. Oh, so I think like going back to like the what the table stakes skills are, like the level
Mm-hmm.
1 skills, I think
Yeah.
like all data scientists should have those.
Yeah.
Like period. Anyone who touches code should have those skills.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't, I think they're going to be in a worse position than frankly I will be.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because like those will form the foundation of like of a career based in like software and code,
Yeah.
right? In terms of what can data scientists do to make my life as an MLOps engineer better, I would say like one thing. So feedback is always good. So I think feedback, if data scientists like if they are running into challenges with their tools
Mm-hmm.
or with stuff that's going on, definitely give feedback. Something I do think that is very helpful is also like expanding one's skill set and knowledge base. So for example, like I think for my own career, right? Like I've made a ton of different pivots, like from from a front desk girl at a hair salon making 20K, right, to a growth hacker to a data analyst, data scientist, like MLOps engineer. I mean, some of those decisions were like they were intentional, but part of those pivots was also saying like, hey, I'm willing to kind of expand like my skill set, and to learn something new that I'm not good at. So something that I do think sometimes like my data science partners could be a little bit better at is troubleshooting stuff.
Yeah.
I would say like,
Mm.
but and that's kind of a like a two. That's double edged though, right? Because if we build like really in-house custom stuff where it's like very hard to troubleshoot, then I can kind of understand it. But I do think that like sometimes it's like being able to just kind of troubleshoot like the biggest one I see is dependency management issues where, for example, they'll install a package or a library and they'll get an error message and they're like, well, why can't we there's a problem here. It's like it's because this version of scikit-learn doesn't play well with this version of TensorFlow.
Mm-hmm.
And you can kind of see it in like the error log in the so those kinds of things I think it's helpful if they can kind of troubleshoot and like know how to troubleshoot and work through
Mm-hmm.
those errors. I would say like the other parts that can be really helpful is I'll say just making sure they're really, really good in their domain, and more importantly, like they know their connection to the business.
Yeah.
Right. Because sometimes some kinds of requests will get, for example, they want to like like engineers, sometimes data scientists want to build a fancy, interesting model that
We
has
do.
no business value, and then they want like the engineering team to commit investment and resources and time to it. And it's like, look,
Mm.
like as an engineering team, we're usually pretty strapped. Like we have to kind of put out multiple fires, and we kind of just cannot be supporting like projects that have no business value other than like, yay, you get to play with like GPT-3, right? Like we can't be in that kind of position. So I would say like that's honestly the most important thing that data scientists can do is like be really, really good at their jobs and like maintain that connection to like the overall business strategy
Mm-hmm.
and like what pain point or feature or product that they're really trying to support.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because I think when they do that, then it makes it easier for us to go like, okay, let's say for example we're getting all these asks for a streaming product as part of like the company's drive or direction. It then makes it easier for us to say like, okay, we can justify putting time to investigate like tools for streaming,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if there is no business value for the projects or products that necessitate us changing the architecture or our infrastructure, then we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So I mean that's like I think something that's like super important.
Yeah, yeah. I don't often go to the agile or their planning, but I do feel it's helpful. Sometimes I go
Yeah.
there just observe, so I know what they're working on. Because as a data scientist, there might be days you don't talk to anybody. Like
Yeah.
after you talk to the business, well, I mean, I always encourage people to constantly align with their stakeholders. But sometimes when you know what you're doing, you might have weeks you just work on your own model, so you
Yeah.
feel maybe isolated to the engineering team. I honestly don't know what they're working on, although we're just sitting literally next to each other.
Yeah.
So I think it's good to just engage in conversation, go to their sprint planning, know what they're working on, know their goals. So when you try to pitch them a solution, oh, maybe they're like you said, constantly putting out fire. They have something like urgent
Yeah.
to work on. They can't really help you. So if you know ahead of time, maybe like holiday season, usually they're busy, you can plan some collaboration earlier with the
Yeah.
engineer. And also one thing I found is Sometimes you do need to ask for help. I feel like the engineers
Yeah.
who are curious to learn more about machine learning are always willing to help. So maybe
Yeah,
you
yeah,
can
yeah.
say, hey, maybe I can help you with some statistics, and they are excited to help you play with part of your model.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like that's the other part too, that like I think a lot of engineers who are especially working with data scientists or like ML people like also need to be aware of is like not just like the fragmentation of the tools and like the fact that data scientists also have like a
Mhm.
lot of people asking for their time, but it's the fact that like as an engineer, like if you understand what the business cares about and prioritizes and like what they want to see, it also makes us like puts us in a better position to like help serve the business, right?
Yeah. For data scientists who want to make sure their model will work on a larger scale, what
Mm-mm.
is something they can do in their model development?
Yeah, this is tricky because I also think this kind of requires a little bit of like engineering collaboration. So for example, like being able to like have a sandbox environment where you can kind of test on increasing like sizes of data, I think is really super helpful. Also, like having some code review honestly really helps. Also, like for example, if like your model or pipeline is very like SQL heavy, and
Mm,
let's say for example you're using a cloud vendor, you can look at like the analytics of the query to see like how many resources are actually being pulled
yeah.
and like optimize it there, right? So those are some things that help. Seeing if you can get your model honestly to as small size as possible is always like super helpful. Definitely like testing like the code. So for example, if there's a really complex like feature engineering pipeline, definitely like testing it with like edge cases and all this other stuff.
Hmm.
That's like super helpful. Doing some kind of like experimentation on the deployment is also like really important. I don't know if I see a lot of companies doing this, like doing a process of like shadow testing and then
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
canarying and then like gradually rolling out.
Hmm.
I know when I was at Teladoc, like we were working on like trying to do, one team was working on trying to do like a multi-arm bandit testing.
Okay.
I don't think most companies are doing that level of like sophisticated experimentation, but like companies should definitely have that like
Hmm.
infrastructure set up. So if you as a data scientist have access to being able to like A/B test or to deploy models or to do like shadow and canarying
Yeah.
testing and get those analytics, I think that's like really super helpful.
Yeah. I think that also requires to have those pipelines set up.
Yeah, exactly. It
Yeah.
requires that engineering collaboration. So
So basically, it's really hard to know whether it will work well before you test.
So I prefer to start with the assumption that okay, things can break and it's just better to have a process for how we can kind of like I'm not saying deploy and like don't test or all that, but I think having a process and structure in place such that you can kind of like roll stuff back,
Yeah.
I think is like really really helpful cuz like
Hmm.
you kind of can't plan for everything.
Yeah.
Like things do happen. Like let's say for example, your like website or mobile app gets 100x spike in traffic because like some celebrity like said, "Oh yeah, go use this one,"
Yeah.
right? The typical kind of like advice I think is plan for like plan your infrastructure for 10x growth. But what happens if
Mm.
like on one day you have like 100x, right? Like you can't plan for a lot of these like black swan events. Um, so in my head, that should be a priority for like engineering teams that do work with like ML models is like to like prioritize having some kind of experimentation or A/B testing platform. Like gather those, like monitor and like log those metrics, like really understand what's going on, deploy it out, like roll it out slowly, and then have
Mm.
a process for which you can kind of like roll back,
Yeah.
like if you need to.
Right. Yeah. In Amazon, I think we call that two-way door. So
Yeah.
it's not like you launch, it's forever. And also, when you run an A/B test, you can just roll out maybe 10% of the traffic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's part of like having a good blameless culture.
Hmm.
It's something that like I try to help out. I think that's a huge part of having like a blameless culture. I think that's important, especially with data science machine learning products for sure.
Yeah. Previously, you talked about you realize when you were a data scientist, you have to learn some MLOps skills on your own. And you designed a curriculum for yourself for six
Mhm.
months. So, what was it like when you have to learn all those things by yourself? Is 6 months enough?
So OpenAI, they have this like fellowship sort of thing that they do every year.
Mm-hmm.
And like I had applied twice and I gotten rejected twice. And it sounded like a pretty sweet deal, right? Because essentially, I think what it was like, I think it was like a 10K a month stipend. And basically, your goal as part of the fellowship was to just kind of like build cool stuff with whatever OpenAI had at the time.
Yeah.
And then to like publish that like project and use case, right?
Mm-hmm.
So after getting rejected by that twice, I was like, okay, screw it. Like, why can't I just go do my own thing?
Yeah.
So I had come up with like this like roadmap and this curriculum for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I relied very heavily on like courses that were out there. So full stack deep learning was one. I also did. I tried doing Springboard a second time for their ML engineering track. I stopped because basically by the time I stopped with them, I'd already had like the 3 offers, right? So
Okay.
kind of didn't make sense to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
I signed up for some courses on like more DevOps topics on like Udemy. So I put together like a lot of stuff, and honestly, I only ended up doing like 3 or 4 things off that list. And like in my head, I thought, and this could have been like honestly like influenced by a lot of the content that I saw out there.
Mm-hmm.
I legitimately thought I needed to like relearn Java and like Scala. I've actually never touched Scala, but like a lot of the content out there had me believing that like, oh, instead of like just with Python and SQL, I need to go learn like Java and C++ and Scala or whatever, and I need to go learn like
Mm.
Kubernetes and like how to like implement like Kubernetes and all this other stuff. And I think for me personally, what ended up being the most important part of like that learning was serving strategies or serving patterns, how to deploy machine learning pipelines, all the productionization that needed to happen, including like writing the tests, essentially like what it takes to kind of go through the stages,
Mm.
so but it was like a super helpful process in terms of whether or not someone can make that switch. I get the question a lot where people are like, oh, like, can you help me find an entry level MLOps job? And I don't believe they actually exist, because I think to like a data engineering job, I mean, maybe there are. Like, I think, for example, if someone can find an MLOps, like a junior eng like MLOps role in a big company, then that's great. But I think it's very difficult for someone like within 6 months to like hit the ground running in MLOps if they haven't already worked in engineering or data science.
Yeah.
Right? Like you have to have like one of those 2.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't, it's just going to be nightmarish. I think even for myself, like as a going from data scientist to ML ops engineer, honestly, I think a huge part of what helped was working on like the real estate tech startup. Like the classes were really great, but it was like having to, for example, like set up like data pipelines. Like as a data scientist, I wrote everything in pandas, right?
Yeah.
Everyone is dedicated to pandas.
Right.
But when I tried writing a pandas pipeline to process like half a terabyte of real estate data and then dump it in a database, that went very badly.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to actually like relearn how to like write stuff in like pure Python, and also how to use like other libraries, because a lot of the libraries we use as like data scientists, right? Like the reason we love them is they're so easy and
Yeah.
flexible, and you get that like in memory compute. And that's actually like you don't want that for for like data pipelines, for example. So
Mm-hmm.
the experiences that were most impactful for me, it was taking like full stack deep learning and a few other of the workshops was great, but also like trying to build it in real time was also like it was stressful and it was hard. But that probably helped a lot with that like transition. But yeah, like I don't know if someone could like go from 0 to then becoming like an MLOps engineer.
Yeah.
Like I think it would be so hard.
Mm-hmm. So, did you also learn more engineering principles, like how to write tests, basically develop environment and everything during that 6 months?
Yeah, absolutely. So I knew how to write like unit tests, but I think at that point too, my usage of Python was very fluid. So for example, like I wasn't using like type hints or like data classes or
Mm-hmm.
whatnot, right? A lot of the stuff that was like introduced in Python 3.6 and up. So I had to like relearn how to like write good object oriented code was a big one. Because I think the way like a lot of us use like Python is like data scientists is probably a little bit more. It's almost like closer to functional programming, but it's also kind of like not. It's kind
Yeah.
of like whatever like feels right.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you're in
Yeah.
the mood for is like how
Yeah.
you write your Python code, right?
Yeah, I don't think
Yeah,
I wrote a lot of classes myself. Back in the days in AWS, some of my colleagues likes to do that. So basically, I just do some functions. It works. It's probably not perfect. But yeah, I think a lot of data scientists probably never had that experience.
yeah. And like the other stuff that I learned that was like applicable to MLOps too was like doing like the data validation or
Hmm.
data like writing tests for the data itself.
Yeah.
And for the models, it definitely helped my understanding knowledge of like data warehouses, right?
Hmm.
Um, Also like APIs, like how to actually write them and understand them. Because before I didn't do that. So I learned a little bit of like fast API, um, a lot more of like Docker as well. Yeah, that experience was just like it was literally like if I didn't write good code, I was gonna pay for it the next day, which like helped me a lot. Also to get out of like the notebook situation
Yeah.
because my like collaborators or like my coworkers, right? They're like, oh yeah, like make sure you. Oh god, like yeah, it really improved my Git skills for sure. Because before, like as a data scientist, like you know how like when you're like copying pasting commands from like Stack Overflow and then you screw up and you're like,
Yeah.
okay, it looks like I'm it's like okay, I'm gonna delete the
Hmm.
Git file and then just do a new Git repository and then push that.
Yeah.
So I used to do that a lot where my usage of Git was very I run into problems, I like Google search it and all that, copy paste the command and then hope it goes well.
Hmm.
But I couldn't do that like on an engineering team at all. I had to like actually learn how to like collaborate, how to the big one was like learning the difference between a merge versus like a pure merge versus like a rebase,
Hmm.
that versus a cherry pick. That was a big one I had to learn.
Yeah.
But yeah, like everything about like everything about trying to build like a platform and then trying to build the machine learning pipelines, not from the assuming that you already have the model and all that.
Hmm.
That really helped a lot with the transition to like the MLOps role.
Yeah. So actually, I'm going through a similar process.
Yeah.
I did some machine learning work before, but I didn't do a lot of model deployment. It's usually just one line of code. You put it in some SageMaker endpoint, but a lot
Yeah.
of times that's not how business use it. They want to develop into their like in-house
Yeah.
infrastructure. And now I worked with a lot of machine learning engineers. And then I ask people, okay, how can I learn more about, writing better code, engineering best practices? They're like, you just need to write your own code and
Just
get
do it.
code review. Yeah, you just have to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I think the code review, like there are certain elements of like engineering practices and culture that I do really like. Like I think code reviews are like the best gift that you can get. If you get a good code review, like from a staff engineer or someone who's
Hmm.
like way above you, like you learn a lot from that. I
Yeah.
learned more from making mistakes and having someone point them out to me than me like making a mistake and not even knowing it and then
Yeah.
developing that bad habit, or like me doing something well.
Yeah. I remember my first code review was, to my surprise, people's feedback is just, oh, you need to change this variable name. You need to change the function name. I thought people would give me a review on like logic and algorithm and stuff, and people just kind of nitpick on those things, which are important later on. I realized, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, well, you've seen that meme, right? Where someone's like, oh, if you write like 5 lines of code, everyone has like comments about it. But if you write 500 lines of code, it's always like looks good to me.
That's funny. So for folks want to learn more about engineering or ML ops, besides collaborating with the engineers, what are some books, resources they can study?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ones I kind of always recommend are if they want to go into like MLOps specifically.
Mm-hmm.
First one is I would check out Full Stack Deep Learning. Right in their current iteration, and they post the lectures and labs for free, like online. The current
Yeah.
iteration, they're a little bit more focused on like how do you productize machine learning as opposed to ML ops. But if someone's like not already familiar with the ML lifecycle, I think that's a great resource,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also free. It's a big selling point there. Goku Mohanda's Made with ML is
Mm-hmm.
also like another great course.
Yeah.
They have he has like an ML like foundations and then an
Mm-hmm.
ML ops, version. So I would check out the ML ops version on the Made with ML site. Also free. It's text based. I actually use it. So I had an intern this summer in for our ML ops team, and so those were two of the resources I recommended to him.
Yeah.
Um, the MLOps community by Demetrios
Mm-hmm.
of the YouTube and the Slack community.
Yeah.
That is an amazing resource. I try to like always watch his stuff for sure. And then I would say in terms of books, so Chip has the machine learning systems design book. I haven't
Mm-hmm.
had a chance to actually read it, but
Yeah.
apparently a lot of people like it.
Mm-hmm.
Another book that a book I'm really excited about that I don't know if it's already published is like Reliable Machine Learning
Mm-hmm.
from Scully, and I think Underwood maybe also co-wrote it. So they're the guys who like helped write or co-write some like the most influential papers like on like production ML and ML ops.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really excited for that book. Alfredo Deza and Noah Gift, they have a book called Practical ML Ops, and especially for people who are really like more interested in resources for Azure, like that's also a really great one.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and I think also too, like they have like a YouTube channel called it's like Pragmatic AI. So I think those are all like really great resources and
Mm-hmm.
are either like free or low cost.
Yeah, yeah, thanks for sharing that. And also, I noticed on the journey of becoming a better engineer, it's very hard to figure things out on your own. Sometimes you just get stuck in this bug. Like the other day, I asked my engineer counterpart, like, "Oh, I keep running this issue. What is the problem?" I'm just looking at his code, and he can figure it out. Oh, it's actually your development environment. You didn't install this and that. It's not just around your code. So stuff like that. So when you try to upskill, did you have a mentor?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of like upskilling, I didn't really have anyone who helped me. Well, okay. So on the Mailchimp team, right?
Mm-hmm.
Huge reason why I enjoyed joining that team was because everyone there was just so much more experienced than me. So for sure, like one of our engineers who was a staff engineer on the team at that time, we had another two senior engineers. When I joined Mailchimp, they definitely have given me like feedback, like on my code or projects and all that. So that was really great. Before I joined Mailchimp and when I was working on the startup stuff, I got some feedback from the co-founder who's working on it, but a lot of it, but not too much on the code itself. A lot of times, in terms of like troubleshooting or figuring out how to write better code, I feel like I still don't have like a great, like I frankly don't have like a great indicator to say like is this good code or bad code, because I see people who they do these like one line commands where they stick like five functions in it, and on the one hand, people love like the one liner functions,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know if a lot of that code is actually like good, because is it like readable to like an engineer that's looking at it, and is it easy to troubleshoot? Like I don't know if it is. So when I'm trying to figure out what does good code kind of look like, I kind of have
Mm-hmm.
to look at like existing packages or libraries that are out there, like scikit-learn or PyTorch or whatever, and I have to just sort of like do that kind of comparison with my own code as as to go like what are they doing here, and like what could I be doing
Mm.
or doing better, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. So now you have worked on so many different roles in data. And what are some mistakes you have made in your career?
So, I mean, yeah, what mistake haven't I made? Like the two or three of the biggest mistakes that like come to mind are one, like being hesitant about getting feedback from folks or my teammates on like the quality of my work or on projects. And for the, and the obvious reason is like when you don't get feedback on how to improve, you just kind of stick in a bubble of mediocrity. And so you just don't move beyond that, right?
Yeah.
I think the second mistake that I've made a lot of times is not building like stronger relationships with my business partners,
Mm.
because I think like even when I was a data scientist, there was a lot of this like kind of an antagonism between like business folks and like data folks.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes down to like the one-on-one relationship with your business partner, a lot of
Mhm.
times they are willing to cut you a lot of slack because they do
Yeah.
understand actually that software's hard.
Mhm.
If you're just like open and honest with them and you like make, incremental like steps forward at least, right? As long as
Mhm.
you're always moving forward and you kind of keep them on the same page, they will cut you a lot of slack. I really regret not, because I always felt like, especially when I was a junior data scientist
Mhm.
or a junior engineer, I always felt like I was kind of like under the gun to deliver something. So that
Yeah.
made me like not want to engage with them.
Right.
And I feel like I just should have engaged with them earlier, like at all parts of the process.
Mhm.
And I think the third major mistake that I've made has been like kind of not sometimes getting involved in like really small value projects or like debates or discussions and kind of getting mad about stuff. And instead, like, I should have just focused. First off, I should have identified for myself, like, instead of saying yes to every project,
Mm.
and then getting burned out, what I should have done was I should have identified, like, what are the projects that will actually, like, move the needle.
Mm.
And then I should have worked my butt off of those and then, like, sold it to, like, my
Yeah.
business partners, like, really kind of showed off the value of it. Instead, I like did the opposite where it's like I said yes to everything, I burned down on everything, I did mediocre like on those projects, and then basically like getting no recognition, right?
Yeah.
Like I
Yeah.
think I should have done the opposite way where it's like be more picky,
Mhm.
work your butt off for those projects, and then like really learn the communication and like the presentation aspect,
Yeah.
and then like keep going, you know. So I'd say like those are like the three major ones.
Yeah. I really like the point you shared. I think a lot of times your managers have some idea, your stakeholder have some idea. I think a lot of the time, those are suggestions. Some
Yeah,
good managers will tell you, "Hey, this is just my idea. You don't have to take it." But like I mentioned, when you just join a company, you feel like you have to do everything
yeah, yeah,
they suggested. Otherwise, they would be upset. Also, maybe because of the culture we come from,
yeah,
right? If you're more senior than me, I do whatever you
yeah, yeah,
ask.
yeah.
Yeah, I think taking that approach you mentioned, figure out what's really important, what's are the steps you must take to get there. So when your manager suggests something, you can say, well, I could do that, but that means I need to deprioritize those steps, which are
Yeah.
very important. Like, is that really important? And then, you give them something to think about instead of just say, hey, no, my plate is full.
Yeah, I mean, like I think like it really is like how do I say like relearning or unlearning? But yeah, it's like
Yeah.
unlearning the like with Japanese culture, right? It's like you respect your elders, you do what they say.
Mm.
There's that saying, right? Like the wheat that sticks his head or sticks his head up gets chopped or something like that. It's
Yeah.
the idea that like you need uniformity and
Right.
and you need to conform, and part of the way you do that is by like not causing a fuss or hassle.
Mm.
So I think what ended up happening was that a lot of times I would approach like conversations that I felt were very scary because I'm basically saying like no to someone,
Right.
and I would like get very panicky and anxious about it. So
Mm.
I'd rather just say yes and then try to deliver on it. And that was like and that's not great. And also even with my parents, like I've had conversations with them about the whole like career growth, because for their generation it was like you stay at a company, you
Yeah.
make your way up, all this good stuff. And like I personally have really struggled with that because I'm much more of a like I want to tackle a challenge, and then once
Mm-hmm.
I've tackled that challenge,
Yeah.
I'm ready for my next challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just like, oh yeah, like, where are you doing this? They're like, you got a job. It's got great pay. It's got great benefits. Like, what are you
Mhm.
doing? Like, all this other stuff. So it is like having to, being able to understand and learn that, like, having an assertive, confident conversation where you're like where you're maintaining your boundaries
Mhm.
is a very healthy, normal thing. And it's also the thing that will make you most successful, like as a data scientist or an MLOps engineer or an ML engineer.
Mhm.
And it's just something I wish I had developed like earlier on, because I think there's a good 3 or 4 years where I just was like saying yes to stuff and getting burned out. And
Yeah.
then like I was adjusting my schedule to work as opposed to like adjusting as opposed to making it more of like a conversation. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some other things you wish you would know earlier in your career?
Yeah, I wish I had honestly focused a lot less on tools and like just gotten good at like a few things. And
Mhm.
so this is like advice like I give like lots of folks who ask me, they're like, what are like the learning resources that you recommend? And I give them like 1 or 2 suggestions. They're like, that's it. I'm like, yeah, because you should just focus on learning that one stack or that
Mhm.
one pattern like really well, or that one
Yeah.
skill.
The foundations.
Yeah. Or even like if it's not just like one, right? But
Mhm.
like, for example, you don't need to learn Python, R, Java, Scala. I don't know, like add in other random Julia, like
Mhm.
add in random languages. Just pick 1 or 2. They're complementary. I always
Yeah.
think Python and SQL, you just can't go wrong with it. Like learn those really well. Learn how to like Python, SQL, and Bash. Actually, it's like doing command line
Mhm.
like shell scripting. Like learn those 3 together, and you're gonna be good for a lot of use cases.
Yeah.
And then other things can kind of be like gradually added on. But I wish I had tried to just understand the high level workflows and like the patterns and focused a lot less on tooling.
Mhm.
Focus on just being very effective with like as few tools as possible. I think would
Yeah.
have been great.
Yeah. And what are some common mistakes you see other people make?
Well, I'll talk about common mistakes I see people make in terms of like pivoting or transitioning, or just even mistakes. One thing I definitely wouldn't do is anytime you're trying to make a career pivot, don't quit your job to then go search for another job.
Mhm.
I mean, and I say this as someone who's done this like twice. But like each time I did that, so for example, like to pivot to MLOps, right? When I quit my job at Teladoc, like my mom, I didn't even tell my parents. I changed this was great. So I changed my status on LinkedIn
Yeah.
Sunday night,
Yeah.
because I'm like, no one's up on Sunday night.
Right.
And that's right. But they're up Monday morning, and it's Sunday night is actually morning over someplace else, right?
Mhm.
So I was like, no one's gonna see this, but I need to make the switch anyway. And then I wake up and it's like there's like 300 reactions to it. And I'm like, damn it. So my parents are definitely gonna see this. So my mom sees it
Your parents
within that
follow you on
day.
LinkedIn?
They do follow me on LinkedIn. Yeah, they follow me on LinkedIn. I think they also follow me on YouTube now.
Okay.
Yeah. So she calls me and she's freaking out.
Mm.
And we basically didn't talk for 2 weeks after
Oh,
that.
wow.
Yeah, it was pretty serious. But what I was trying to tell her was like, so at the time that I quit, I had been interviewing around. I wanted to understand what my options were. And so I had about like the 2 weeks before I quit, I had 10 interviews. I had 5 that were going to final
Mhm.
stage, and I had another couple that they were ready to make an offer. So when I quit, it it wasn't as risky as most people would have thought,
Mhm.
because I had already put aside like at least 8 to 9 months of emergency funds. Better to have a year, but I had 8 to 9 months that I could kind of commit to the cause. My expenses were low. We had like my partner and I, we'd moved into like quarantine pricing apartment, right? So
Nice.
our rent came down
Yeah.
like individually, right? And then and I had their support too, which was great. And I always kind of knew that like, look, if the 6 month sabbatical like didn't work out at any point in time, I could go back and I
Yeah.
could interview for a job,
Mhm.
right? So for me, it wasn't risky to make that decision. So if someone is looking to like change careers, like try as much as possible to de-risk before, like, most people don't make huge big sweeps or huge big decisions, and are successful at it unless they have already in fact been planning for it or they
Mm-hmm.
have had resources at their disposal.
Yeah.
So I think that's like a big one. And I
Mm-hmm.
think a really easy way that people can like de-risk pivoting is by start doing the work for the job that you want to get. Do the work early, right? So for example, if someone's interested in transitioning to MLOps, either as a data scientist or a software engineer, then I would say like as a software engineer, like, go take some classes on machine learning, go
Mm-hmm.
build some models, like go through the process and then like go build some projects. Same with the data scientist. If a data scientist wants to move more to an MLOps role, they should also do that.
Yeah.
Like they should create a project because a project, doing a hackathon, all this other stuff like that is like free. Also, like one suggestion too that like I was thinking about is like open source contribution. Like people say all the time that's like really like important. And like that's another way, for example, that data scientists or SWEs can like move into MLOps.
Yeah.
It's like go find like an MLOps like, and there are tons of like open source libraries or packages or communities out there. Go use the tool, or better yet, go to like the issues tab of the GitHub repo
Mm.
and like look at all the problems people are reporting, and for those bugs download the tool, like try to use it, see if you can replicate the bug, give that person more information, and then try to do a small fix on it, like create a PR, and then maybe someone will look at it or it'll get merged or what have you. And if they have like meetings for like contributors, like go to those meetings in those office hours, be involved in the community. Like that's like a really great way to get a foot into the door and to also contribute to like an open source package.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So like there's a lot of things people can do ahead of time before they try to make the jump. And then the other part I would caution people about is like seeing it as a jump, like because you can build in those skill sets like in your existing job or in your existing work without having to like immediately jump to a new job.
Mm.
So for example, if a data scientist wanted to eventually move more into MLOps, like they could start by implementing like MLOps practices in their existing work, right? They could like work more closely with the engineering team. They could get together like a group of friends to go do like a hackathon. They could find people doing a hackathon and basically say like, hey, can I provide like the engineering support for your data science project? So instead of like the data scientist going like, oh yeah, I'm going to go help train the model for a Kaggle hackathon, it's like partnering with someone who is going to train the model and basically say like, oh, can I help you make your model into like a service, right? Slap a Streamlit app on there, it's like you're good.
Yeah.
Like there's so many ways people can kind of like eventually kind of like pivot or make their way into that position, or into that kind of work without having to make like big swings. And there's ways people can do it like in their existing jobs.
Yeah.
And if someone too, like if someone is looking for a job though, like let's say you're in between jobs and you have to figure out, and you have like a timeline and a family to support and all that, I would say like honestly don't try to hold out for an MLOps job. But I would say like try to just get any job like working with data science and machine learning, and be the person that like brings in and implements those like skills and those practices, because you can do the work without having to have the title already.
Yeah.
And that'll just make it
Exactly.
easier for you to get the next job.
Yeah. Yeah. I really love all the points you mentioned. Specifically, don't feel limited by your job title. If you
Yeah.
want to learn something, collaborate with a person, with a project, help them using some skills that they don't have, but and also plus one on the open source community. And that's someone doing code review
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
your
Free
contribution.
code
Free
review.
code review. Yeah, exactly. And I think another thing about mistakes we previously chatted before, I wonder if you want to elaborate on that. So I think when we chatted, you talk about sometimes when people set up their project, you don't think about it in the beginning, and that could be an issue in the end.
Yeah. I mean, like I think it's like that whole like I think it's like that advice for like if you want to know how to write a story, start at the very end. And it's kind of the same thing with like projects or models. It goes back to one, know what your deployment or serving strategy is going to be. Like what is the final output that your model needs to be? Is it a container? Is it a package? And then kind of work back, like is it going to be used behind an API? Like understand those like the last details and then
Mhm.
work your way back to like what do you need to have, right? For example, if it's going to be a Python package, there are certain things that need to be included in order for you to like, upload it to PyPI or Conda Forge, I think is what it is, right?
Mhm.
If it's going to be a container, very kind of similarly, like understand, for example, what like the Docker file you need to write, like what do you need to include in it? If it's going to be hosted or all that good stuff. And then like also understanding like what your like CI/CD like situation looks like. I think when you understand like the process or the journey your model needs to go through to become available to people, I think that makes it much easier to like get your project in a good spot. Because for example, like, well, I don't know, like it goes back to like, do I think it's a good philosophy for Jupyter Notebook to be at the center of like an end-to-end ML ops, like ML platform?
Mm.
Time will tell, honestly. But I think like if you start with the end in mind, then it makes it easier to understand that like, look, if you want to use a Jupyter Notebook to like develop your initial model, your
Yeah.
features, like go ahead. At some point, all those are going to have to be broken up into like individual scripts or classes and all that stuff. But
Mhm.
if you want to start with that, there's no reason why someone shouldn't start with it. Eventually, like you are going to need like, XYZ things. So for some people, they like to use a tool like Cookiecutter just to have the project already set up so they don't even have to think about the structure. And other people are going to be like, you know what? I want to use my notebook because I just want to get like a POC going,
Yeah.
right? Like before I invest any like engineering or like software time into this, I just want to even know if there's like signal in the data. Is this analysis or prediction like valuable to the business? So I think like once you understand like that journey, you can then feel free to like innovate and like explore at the front end of it without having to worry later on about, oh, how am I going to now get the model in front of people?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, what do you think about the future of ML ops?
I mean, I think it's bright. So like Mihail Eric, he wrote that blog post, MLOps is a mess, but that's to be expected. And he had that one like diagram or image from I forgot which VC it is. I think it's like Matt Turk is his name, where it's like 1,000 like different data ML machine learning tools. So I agree with the premise of like the blog post, which is basically saying that like right now we're kind of like nascent in terms of like MLOps. Right now we're still borrowing a lot from like DevOps or other like areas.
Yeah.
Um and also too, like there's so many different competitors in terms of tooling. So
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of that, especially like over the next like 2-3 years, I think we will eventually, I don't know, like I think we'll develop like patterns or stacks. Like I think there will be some like personas or patterns that people like. But at the same time, there's been that joke going around. Have you seen that where or someone was like, "Oh, like right now we can do a cool prompt in like Dolly." And then it's like 2028. Oh, we need a prompt engineer to do like a proper like prompt query and all sorts of. So maybe we might have like more specialization in certain
Yeah.
areas like
Mm-hmm.
natural language processing and computer vision. Maybe we'll see a lot more stuff come out, especially in terms of like multi-model pipelines
Yeah.
and all that,
Mm.
and other kind of like large language or like large like anything models. But yeah, I guess we'll have to see. Like I do think it will mature and shake out. It probably won't be for another like 3 or 4 years,
Mm-hmm.
but it definitely will.
Yeah. And so now you don't build a machine learning model. Do you miss the data science part of a project?
Not at all. I miss none of it. No, I'm fully converted over to the dark side, and I'm like pretty happy about it.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, and to be honest, like most of like, so I do like live code demo, or I'm starting to do live code demos
Mm.
on top of like the live streams and like the YouTube videos that I
Yeah.
do. And what I really love is doing everything but the feature engineering
Yeah.
and training the model and doing
Mm.
the hyperparameter tuning. I like setting up all that stuff. So I am definitely very happy in partnering with data scientists and
Mm-hmm.
kind of like if they're like happy doing their thing, then I'm like happy as a duck doing my thing too.
Yeah, yeah. That's a very interesting because I have a friend. She recently joined Intuit. She's a data scientist and she works with, I think, maybe in her team, they call it machine learning engineer, probably doing something you do,
Maybe.
ML ops engineer. And I asked her, do you want to be doing MLOps or like machine learning. She said, no, I like talking to the business and
Yeah.
develop my model. But if I'm a ML engineer or doing ML ops, the stakeholders are data scientists. She's like, I think I like talk to business more. So I think different people have different preferences. It's not like one type is better than the others.
Yeah, totally. Like, I think it's like, I think the ideal arrangement is you get people who really love doing their like thing,
Yeah.
and then you get people who are like complementary in that
Right.
aspect where they like doing the thing that no one else likes doing,
Mhm.
and you get them all in a group, and that's like, I think a lot of times that's like a really great mix. I think like when we've done, when we've like interviewed candidates for the team, or even like in other teams that I've been on like the interview panel for, sometimes like you'll get candidates where they're like, oh, we want to do everything, and you kind of can't tell like, well, what do you actually want to do? Like,
Yeah.
are you trying to be helpful, or is it the case that we're going to hire you for like team A, but you really like doing like, team B type of work, and then you're going to go jump to team B like within 3 to 6 months of joining team A.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I mean, like, and we've had some folks where, when we've interviewed, like when they've interviewed for the team, we asked them, it's like, would you rather do your own model pipeline end to end and only do one or two of those a year, or do you want to build tooling that helps like 10 other data scientists deploy their models? um and what we found is that a lot of times our like best candidates or best hires have been people who are like, no, 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 we're good building the thing, and like the data scientists can like build their models, and we'll just like facilitate their success, and we're good with that.
Yeah.
And that's like the best like hires that we've had, frankly. Yeah, but I think it's interesting because like I feel like there's a difference between a startup versus like an enterprise company. In a startup, it's very easy to wear multiple hats, and I think that's like the fun part of it.
Yeah.
But like in an enterprise company, if you are also building models but also building like infrastructure and tooling, it would be so easy to burn out.
Yeah. And how do you see your career grow?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting because I've like really kind of thought about, what do I want to do next? So like the early part of my career was just honestly focused on like paying rent, saving money,
Yeah.
not being in like a financially like vulnerable position. Then I think the second part of my career has been like, okay, now I want to like actually build a career in something, in something intentionally. I want to succeed. I want to get like a better title, better compensation. Um, Right now, though, I'm like I think I'm starting like a different stage in my career where instead of saying like, okay, I want to hit this title, like, I want to go get promoted up the ladder, and I
Yeah.
want to make this kind of money. Instead, I'm like really kind of thinking about like, well, what's the kind of work that I really like doing?
Yeah.
And like, how can I make an earning doing the kind of work that I really love doing, but also have like freedom to go travel
Yeah.
and to not have to do a 2-3 hour commute or all that. Like, to me, money and title are starting to be a lot less important,
Yeah.
as much as like making like just enough money to do like the fun things and to go live a good life, to, like eventually support a family. But also having like the health and wellness like
Yeah.
aspect of it too, and having healthy boundaries.
Mhm.
So I mean, in terms of like kind of like my next step, so like right now, for example, I love everything about like trying to make machine learning work like out in industry for different companies, and I love building and I love learning all the time. So right now, for example, I'm working on an MLOps course. It's going to be like kind of an intro to MLOps. I'm trying to make it like, frankly, stack agnostic, and more about what are the different problems that are being solved at the different stages.
Yeah.
I also have the YouTube channel. I do live streams. I also have like an email newsletter that I write. So for me, like I'm like really focused on continue to learn the field because it's so new, and I'm definitely like not like an expert at all. Like, keep learning as much as I can, use those learnings to like really build cool stuff, and then like help kind of teach people or show people like how they can build like really cool machine learning products or services themselves, and then just like going from there. So who knows what the next step is. It might be like less engineering, and it might be a lot more maybe like developer relations, or
Hmm.
solutions consulting or something.
Yeah, that sounds very exciting. So you mentioned there are some courses about ML ops, and what made you want to create your own course?
There actually aren't that many MLOps courses out there, oddly enough. Like
Mm.
I think there's a few, but of the quality ones I mentioned, I think the ones I talked about might be like the only ones that I've seen out there that have like significant traction. There's also these courses on Udemy by Soledad Gali and Christopher. I forgot his last name. They have two courses I really love, but outside of that, there aren't really like a whole lot of courses beyond like talks and like podcasts and all that
Hmm.
and papers. So the big motivation was for people who are trying to make the pivot into MLOps and actually maybe don't have like the data science or software engineering experience, or maybe they only have one or the other. I
Hmm.
wanted to talk about MLOps from the perspective of here are the problems that are being solved. Because I think a lot of times in the process of trying to become manageable, I think a lot of courses like they become very opinionated on the stack. And to a certain extent, I kind of believe that like for a good at I think in this area, someone's going to need to be really kind of flexible and adaptable to new
Yeah.
patterns and tools. So I'd rather kind of help them focus on the pattern recognition and understanding like the deep why as
Mm.
opposed to focusing on the tools.
Yeah.
And I think part of it too is for me, like you were mentioning, right, like when you were getting started, like as a data scientist, you're trying to write better code,
Hmm.
and maybe like people are giving you pointers and you have no idea why they're telling you this stuff,
Yeah.
and also you don't know like what questions to ask.
Right.
Like that was like a huge part of my experience was when I was pivoting more to an engineering role as opposed to data science. Like I didn't have like for me, like I didn't grow up studying computer science, right? Like I didn't study computer science in undergrad. I wasn't really interested in computers before like even college. um I think I learned Python only like a few years ago.
Hmm.
So for me, like I felt like I was lacking a lot of the software engineering and like computer science context for someone to actually understand like ML ops. And so for me, I'm always interested in helping people understand the why. Like
Yeah.
what's the story behind like why we have like Docker containers? Like
Right.
when would you use one versus like for a data scientist, it's like when would you use a container versus like a virtual environment?
Mm.
Or why is like a certain package like structured a certain way?
Yeah.
Or like if you're just getting started on a project, why do you need to test like malls instead of malls and data and not just code? Right. I'm
Yeah.
always interested in the why and helping people like understand the story behind it.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of going to be more the flavor of the course. Is it's going to be a lot lighter on like implementation.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a lot more kind of working people through building the layers of their like own mental model
Mm.
of
Yeah.
MLOps.
Yeah. I really want to take that course because I took some engineering course. I feel like those are designed for people who already have some
Yeah.
engineering skills. And for data science, we're kind of in a weird situation. We know how to code. We don't need to start from scratch, but also we don't, like you mentioned, I don't
Yeah.
know all the context. Maybe for some of the listeners, you never heard of things like Docker or Kubernetes. And if someone
Yeah.
first introduced to you, it doesn't work if they just say, hey, those are the things you need to run, but why? And
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
when you're introducing a new tool, new language to people, I think um, there's some time for people to feel familiar with this thing. So sometimes
Yeah.
people feel intimidated to learn and they never learn. I think there are times I tried to learn how to use Git better. I just couldn't find a good resource. So I
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
just give up. And then like some engineers or other coworkers give me a few lines of code. I just put it
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
notes. And whenever I need to use it, I just like copy paste, but I never really understood it.
Yeah, and I mean like so there's like one great resource out there is like the Missing CS Semester by like MIT. Like
Mm,
it's a free course.
yeah.
And the reason for the name was because so they cover things, for example, like building like Git. Like what is Git and like how is it designed under the hood and all
Mm,
that good stuff. They cover like make files, they cover like testing, they cover logging. Like they cover basically a lot of the topics that computer science undergrads like would need in order to be functional and effective like software engineers,
Yeah.
right? That's how I learned like how to use Git, was because before it was very much the same. I just copied whatever commands,
Yeah.
and then if it screwed up, it's like that one XKCD comic. I just deleted like the Git history and then
Mhm.
just did a new one,
Yeah.
right? Because I didn't understand like actually how Git worked under the hood. And so the missing CS semester, they have this one talk on Git, and they explain that. They explain the conceptual model, and I'm like, "Oh my god, like I understand this so much better." And I feel like I'm the type of person where you can't you can't just tell me to go do it and to
Mhm.
jump in, get my hands dirty,
Yeah.
and like, oh, don't worry, you won't break anything. I'm the type of person where I'm like, no, no, you need to tell me the why.
Yeah.
You need to tell me, give me like an understanding of how it works
Mhm.
and why I need to be doing it and why the solution is the best way to go. And
Yeah.
then I can kind of like go do it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, like like people are different, right? Like I'm definitely I wish I was more like the jump in, go break stuff, get my hands dirty. But for me, like, yeah, like I'm more of like I need the visuals, I need the story, I need like the spark notes of this.
Yeah, I think there needs to be more course designed for data scientists and teach them engineering skills or maybe communication skills specific for this persona, because we are collabing with
Yeah,
people
yeah,
wearing all hats, and sometimes we need to wear them on
yeah, yeah,
ourselves. Like
absolutely.
a data engineering course for data scientists, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, like because I mean, some data engineers probably they would hear this whole like you tried to write a pipeline in Python or in
Hmm.
pandas.
Yeah.
It's terrible. It's like, well, yeah, but that's like the only tool that I knew like as a
Yeah.
data scientist.
Right.
So, you know, that's what I'm going to use. And data scientists come from all sorts of backgrounds.
Hmm.
Like for me, I didn't come from even as like an analyst, like I think I was mostly working with SQL. I wasn't doing a whole lot in Python. I only
Yeah.
picked up Python during the Springboard data science track,
Hmm.
which was maybe 4 years ago or something. Maybe I think, um, and I picked it up because I had to. I had a little bit of art before that, but like yeah, like people are going to use what they know. So if you don't expose them to new ideas or skills in a way that's
Mm.
accessible, they're not gonna use it, right?
Yeah, yeah. So now, how do you continue learn new skills?
Yeah. So definitely newsletter. Well, so there's learning skills, and then there's keeping abreast of the industry. So I do
Yeah.
that through newsletters.
Hmm.
In terms of, and also like the YouTube channels and the podcasts. In terms of learning new skills, like what I kind of do is like almost like every 6 months, I kind of look at like what jobs are asking for, and then
Ah, interesting.
anything
Yeah.
that like I don't focus on anything that's like super. So okay, so like for example, if I look at 100 job descriptions,
Yeah.
if only one of them mentions like a certain skill, I'm like,
Mm,
I'm not learning
that's an
that.
outlier.
That's an outlier. But if like 40 of them are like, oh yeah, you should know this, and I'm like, I don't know this, I'm like, oh,
Mm.
I should probably go learn that. I do feel like I kind of there's a lot more I always don't know than I do know. Like I have like shelves of books and like tons of bookmarks on like different projects or videos where I'm
Mm.
like, I don't know this thing. I should go do it.
Yeah, that's so smart. I think it would be a fun project to work on. You just scrape the data, the text of like 100 jobs,
Yeah.
like data science jobs, and then just look at the skill sets. Yeah, I always suggest people to do that when they try to look for a job and figure out what you want to, what you need to learn, how
Yeah.
you need to prioritize. I think same goes for people who already have a job. How do you continue to develop yourself? Because if you're in the same role for a few years, for in the same company, you feel comfortable.
Yeah.
You don't know what's going on. So sometimes when I move to a new team, I realize, oh, they're using this set of tools. I never heard of those before. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. So what do you like to do outside of the world of machine learning and engineering?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, my quarantine activity that I picked up was I actually took a class on how to like make shoes.
Mm,
So like how to like customize sneakers.
yeah.
That was a really fun class.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually really like I love working with my hands. I definitely need something like away from the computer.
Right.
So I'm like absolutely obsessed with like learning everything about making clothes, shoes, bags, jackets.
Yeah.
So yes, like right now I have like I have sheets of leather just like in
Mm.
a corner of my room. I have an entire workstation
Yeah.
behind my desk with just like sheets of like red, pink, and
Mhm.
like gold leather
Yeah.
and all stuff for shoes. I love collecting like vintage fabrics
Mhm.
to then make into clothes. So I have a lot of like vintage kimono fabrics actually that I use to like make dresses and like shirts and
Oh.
blouses.
Yeah.
I was also learning how to do embroidery and weaving and like bead embroidery. So yeah, I spent a lot of time learning that kind of stuff. I'm just starting to get back into working out. I didn't do that for like a long part of quarantine, but I love like weightlifting. I love boxing. I
Mhm.
love taking dance lessons, roller skating. So yeah, so I try to do more of that like outside of work, and to
Mhm.
stay like active and all that. But I think making clothes is like my favorite thing, and also like all like the content stuff too.
Yeah. So, what are you excited about in your life and career right now?
Like I'm definitely excited about like learning how to create content. I think way back in the day, I think I wanted to do a lot more creative work, especially like illustrative and video and all that.
Mhm.
So now that's like my opportunity to do that. So I'm very
Yeah.
excited because I love teaching, I love mentoring,
Mhm.
and I also love learning stuff. So I'm very excited about that kind of stuff. Um, Other parts, like in terms of my career, like in my head, I was thinking about, do I want to keep going up the ladder? Because I've had like a lot of the feedback I've gotten like over the past couple years was I should go into like management and like
Yeah.
leadership.
Mhm. I think you'll be a
And
great manager.
yeah, I think so. I think eventually I will make my way into like a leadership role of some
Mhm.
kind. But for now, it's like I want to continue to get really good at my craft.
Mm.
So for me, I'm trying to figure out like, what does that actually look like over the next 2, 3 years? Does that mean like continuing to go up the technical? Like, does it look like continuing to go up like the core engineering route? Or does it mean, do I do engineering like adjacent work, like
Yeah.
solutions consulting, where you're not like building like internal stuff, but you're like then implementing that solution? So that's like something I'm like really interested in figuring out. And then the other part I'm like trying to also figure out, because for the longest time I used to have these like, these like goals, right? It's like go get to staff at engineer by
Mm.
like 2025, like go make, this amount of money
Yeah.
by like 2000 and like 23,
Mm.
like have a, you know, X million-dollar net worth by
Yeah.
like 2030 or whatever, right? Like
Yeah.
I had a lot of those goals and I used to have them like on like a whiteboard. But
Mhm.
then I started thinking about like maybe that's like getting too like granular in
Mm.
some ways. Like, why should my career and money be like separate goals?
Right.
Right. Like, or better yet, like, why should my career and money and like my personal happiness, like, why should those be like separate goals and why are they not
Mm.
like the same goal?
Right.
Like, do really cool work, like making X amount of money for myself and having fun and being healthy while doing it.
Mhm.
So that's like what I'm really starting to think about in terms of like my career is like how can I get better at my skill set, but also how can I start like designing more of like the life that I want
Mm.
instead of just kind of accepting like, oh yeah, like first I need to go get this title, I need to go work at this company, and then I'll grow my like ladder or whatever. Because I think that was the thing like everyone saw during quarantine was that life is just like way too short.
Yeah.
And I know for me, like being stuck indoors for 2 years, like I never thought I loved traveling. I honestly am like such a homebody. I
Mhm.
was born and raised in San Francisco. I went to
Yeah.
San Diego for school. I came right back. And it's been 7 years.
Yeah.
And I had never really had a desire to travel.
Mm.
But after 2 years, I'm like, yeah, I'm like ready to go travel. I'm ready to go
Mhm.
sightsee. And I don't necessarily want to always like basically have to ask like to to go, it's like, oh, can I like do 2 weeks of PTO? Like I don't always kind of want to do that. So
Yeah.
I'm like starting to like kind of think about more like that.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that's exciting. So for folks who want to follow your career journey and know more about your course, your office hour, your live coding, where can I find you?
Yeah, so they can find me on LinkedIn. Full name Mikiko Bazeley. I'm there. They can also find me on YouTube. I have a channel also with my name. I have a Twitter account. I also have a Substack. Honestly, if you go to my LinkedIn or you go to my YouTube channel, I have everything like linked in both those places. So
Mm,
if they land there, they can find out more about all those other channels if they want.
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mickey, for coming to the show.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Take care, everyone.